Every seed is a miniature miracle. God has programmed the tiny sequoia seed to become the largest tree on earth, reaching nearly 300 feet tall and weighing many tons. God has designed the humble apple seed to yield a bounty of delicious fruit for years to come. And God has planned a multitude of seeds to produce spectacular blossoms in abundance. Consider the many varieties of seeds. As stated in Genesis, each seed always produces after its own kind. And just as the Lord intended, the fruits and byproducts that they bear have supplied the needed food and resources for man and his environment.
In the first chapter of Genesis, God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth," and it was so. So the Creator made life with the ability to reproduce after its kind. Plants produce seed. This answers the question, which came first, the seed or the plant? Clearly, God created plant life with the seed in itself.
Seeds are masterpieces of micro-miniaturization. Inside each seed is a little baby, a little embryonic plant. It's already got leaves, and a stem and a root. It's surrounded by a seed coat that protects it and filled with all kinds of receptors listening in to environmental signals so it knows what temperature, what moisture conditions, how much oxygen. All these things have to be present before it will sprout. And the first seeds we find as fossils look just like the seeds that we have today. The seed is the first reproductive structure God made on creation day 3, and it's the way living things ever since have multiplied after kind.
Today, scientists have discovered what Scripture stated all along. Inside the unassuming seed is life itself. Contained within are living cells, tiny factories of amazing complexity. No scientist has been able to build a synthetic seed, and no seed is simple. Seeds are programmed to remain dormant until water and warmth are available. Who installed this ability to monitor temperature and humidity? Who determined the proper time for the seed to germinate? Who told the root, "You must go down," and the stem, "You must head upward"? Do you see the guiding hand of our all-loving Creator? In order to sprout and thrive, seeds require the proper soil nutrients, the ideal properties found in water, the correct frequency spectrum of light, the right atmosphere, and the necessary pollinators. All of these must have been in place from the beginning in order for seeds to yield a harvest of blessings for mankind.
They all feed off the Earth's heat, all except the cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae. They alone have the capacity to turn to the sun to capture its energy. The engine of life is linkage. Everything is linked. Nothing is self-sufficient. Water and air are inseparable, united in life and for our life on Earth. Sharing is everything. The green expanse peeking through the clouds is the source of oxygen in the air. 70% of this gas, without which our lungs cannot function, comes from the algae that tint the surface of the oceans. Our Earth relies on a balance in which every being has a role to play and exists only through the existence of another being. A subtle, fragile harmony that is easily shattered. Thus, corals are born from the marriage of algae and shells. Coral reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, but they provide a habitat for thousands of species of fish, mollusks, and algae. The equilibrium of every ocean depends on them. They grow unhurriedly toward the sun that nourishes their foliage. The power to capture light's energy. They store it and feed off it, turning it into wood and leaves, which then decompose into a mixture of water, mineral, vegetable, and living matter. And so, gradually, soils are formed. Soils teem with the incessant activity of microorganisms feeding, digging, aerating, and transforming. They make the humus, the fertile layer to which all life on land is linked. How many species are we aware of? 1/10 of them? 100th, perhaps? What do we know about the bonds that link them? Families of animals form, united by customs and rituals that are handed down through the generations. In the great adventure of life on Earth, every species has a role to play. Every species has its place. None is futile or harmful. They all balance out. Despite your vulnerability, you have taken possession of every habitat and conquered swaths of territory like no other species before you. Even today, the planet, 1 person in 4 lives as humankind did 6,000 years ago. Their only energy, that which nature provides, season after season. It's the way of life of 1.5 billion people, more than the combined population of all the wealthy nations. As long as every extra pair of hands is a necessary contribution to its subsistence. The invention of agriculture turned our history on end. It resulted in the first surpluses and gave birth to cities and civilizations. Our principal daily concern is to feed ourselves. When the soil is less than generous and the water becomes scarce, we are able to deploy prodigious efforts to extract from the land enough to live on. Humans shape the land with the patience and devotion that the earth demands in an almost sacrificial ritual performed over and over. Agriculture is still the world's most widespread occupation. Half of humankind tills the soil, over 3/4 of them by hand. Agriculture is like a tradition handed down from generation to generation in sweat, graft, and toil, because for humanity, it is a prerequisite of survival. Humankind found a way to tap into the energy buried deep in the earth. These flames are also from plants. It's coal, it's gas, and above all, it's oil. And this pocket of sunlight freed humans from their toil on the land. With oil began the era of humans who break free of the shackles of time. With oil, some of us acquired unprecedented comforts. And in 50 years, in a single lifetime, the Earth has been more radically changed than by all previous generations of humanity. Over half of the world's 7 billion inhabitants live in cities. The world's first megalopolis is the symbol of the exploitation of the energy the Earth supplies to human genius. The manpower of millions of immigrants, the energy of coal, the unbridled power of oil. America was the first to harness the phenomenal revolutionary power of black gold. In the fields, machines replaced men. A liter of oil generates as much energy as 100 pairs of hands in 24 hours. In the United States, only 3 million farmers are left. They produce enough grain to feed 2 billion people. But most of that grain is not used to feed people. Here, and in all other industrialized nations, it's transformed into livestock feed or biofuels. The pocket of sunshine's energy chased away the specter of drought that stalked farmland. No spring escapes the demands of agriculture, which accounts for 70% of humanity's water consumption. In nature, everything is linked. The expansion of cultivated land and single-crop farming encouraged the development of parasites. Pesticides, another gift of the petrochemical revolution, exterminated them. Bad harvests and famine became a distant memory. The biggest headache now was what to do with the surpluses engendered by modern agriculture. But toxic pesticides seeped into the air, soil, plants, animals, rivers, and oceans. They penetrated the heart of cells similar to the mother cell that is shared by all forms of life. Are they harmful to the humans that they released from hunger? These farmers, in their yellow protective suits, probably have a good idea. Then came fertilizers, another petrochemical discovery. They produced unprecedented results on plots of land thus far ignored. Three-quarters of the varieties developed by farmers over thousands of years have been wiped out. As far as the eye can see, fertilizer below, plastic on top. The greenhouses of Almeria in Spain are Europe's vegetable garden. A city of uniformly sized vegetables waits every day for the hundreds of trucks that will take them to the continent's supermarkets. The more a country develops, the more meat its inhabitants consume. How can growing worldwide demand be satisfied without recourse to concentration camp-style cattle farms? Faster and faster, like the life cycle of livestock which may never see a meadow. Manufacturing meat faster than the animal has become a daily routine. In these vast food lots trampled by millions of cattle, not a blade of grass grows. A fleet of trucks from every corner of the country brings in tons of grain, soy meal, and protein-rich granules that will become tons of meat. The result is that it takes 100 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of potatoes, 4,000 liters for 1 kilo of rice, and 13,000 liters for 1 kilo of beef, not to mention the oil guzzled in the production process and transport. Our agriculture has become oil-powered. It feeds twice as many humans on Earth, but has replaced diversity with standardization. It has offered many of us comforts we could only dream of, but it makes our way of life totally dependent on oil. This is the new measure of time. Our world's clock now beats to the rhythm of these indefatigable machines tapping into the pocket of sunlight. The whole planet is attentive to these metronomes of our hopes and illusions. The same hopes and illusions that proliferate along with our needs, increasingly insatiable desires and profligacy. We know that the end of cheap oil is imminent, but we refuse to believe it. Are no longer counted in miles, but in minutes. The automobile shapes new suburbs where every home is a castle, a safe distance from the asphyxiated city centers, and where neat rows of houses huddle around dead-end streets. The model of a lucky few countries has become a universal dream preached by televisions all over the world. Even here in Beijing, it is cloned, copied, and reproduced in these formatted houses that have wiped pagodas off the map. The automobile has become the symbol of comfort and progress. If this model were followed by every society, the planet wouldn't have 900 million vehicles as it does today, but 5 billion. Faster and faster. The more the world develops, the greater its thirst for energy. Everywhere, machines dig, bore, and rip from the Earth the pieces of stars buried in its depths since its creation. Minerals. As a privilege of power, 80% of this mineral wealth is consumed by 20% of the world's population. Before the end of this century, excessive mining will have exhausted nearly all the planet's reserves. Dubai is like the new beacon for all the world's money. Nothing seems further removed from nature than Dubai, although nothing depends on nature more than Dubai. Dubai is a sort of culmination of the Western model. We haven't understood that we're depleting what nature provides. We are destroying the cycle of a life that was given to us. At the current rate, all fish stocks are threatened with exhaustion. Fish is the staple diet of 1 in 5 humans. We have forgotten that resources are scarce. 500 million humans live in the world's desert lands, more than the combined population of Europe. They know the value of water. They know how to use it sparingly. Here, they depend on wells replenished by fossil water, which accumulated underground in the days when it rained on these deserts. But there is a heavy price to pay. Fossil water is a non-renewable resource. In Saudi Arabia, the dream of industrial farming in the desert has faded. Israel turned the desert into arable land. Even though these hothouses are now irrigated drop by drop, water consumption continues to increase along with exports. The once mighty River Jordan is now just a trickle. Its water has flown to supermarkets all over the world in crates of fruit and vegetables. The Jordan's fate is not unique. Across the planet, one major river in 10 no longer flows into the sea for several months of the year. Deprived of the Jordan's water, the level of the Dead Sea goes down by over 1 meter per year. India risks being the country that suffers most from the lack of water in the coming century. Massive irrigation has fed the growing population, and in the last 50 years, 21 million wells have been dug. In many parts of the country, the drill has to sink ever deeper to hit water. In western India, 30% of wells have been abandoned. The underground aquifers are drying out. In dry season, women from local villages dig them with their bare hands. Thousands of kilometers away, 800 to 1,000 liters of water are consumed per person per day. Las Vegas was built out of the desert. Millions of people live there. Thousands more arrive every month. The inhabitants of Las Vegas are among the biggest consumers of water in the world. Palm Springs is another desert city with tropical vegetation and lush golf courses. How long can this mirage continue to prosper? The Earth cannot keep up. The Colorado River, which brings water to these cities, is one of those rivers that no longer reaches the sea. Water levels in the catchment lakes along its course are plummeting. Water shortages could affect nearly 2 billion people before 2025. Wetlands represent 6% of the surface of the planet. Under their calm water lies a veritable factory where plants and microorganisms patiently filter the water and digest all the pollution. These marshes are indispensable environments for the regeneration and purification of water. They are sponges that regulate the flow of water. They absorb it in the wet season and release it in the dry season. In our race to conquer more land, we have reclaimed them as pasture for our livestock, or as land for agriculture or building. In the last century, half of the world's marshes were drained. All living matter is linked. Water, air, soil, trees. The world's magic is right in front of our eyes. Trees breathe groundwater into the atmosphere as light mist. They form a canopy that alleviates the impact of heavy rains. The forests provide the humidity that is necessary for life. They store carbon, containing more than all the Earth's atmosphere. They are the cornerstone of the climactic balance on which we all depend. The trees of the primary forests provide a habitat for 3/4 of the planet's biodiversity. That's to say, of all life on Earth. These forests provide the remedies that cure us. The substances secreted by these plants can be recognized by our bodies. Our cells talk the same language. We are of the same family. But in barely 40 years, the world's largest rainforest, the Amazon, has been reduced by 20%. The forest gives way to cattle ranches or soybean farms. 95% of these soybeans are used to feed livestock and poultry in Europe and Asia. And so, a forest is turned into meat. Barely 20 years ago, Borneo, the fourth largest island in the world, was covered by a vast primary forest. At the current rate of deforestation, it will have totally disappeared within 10 years. Living matter bonds water, air, earth, and the sun. In Borneo, this bond has been broken in what was one of the Earth's greatest reservoirs of biodiversity. And for paper has increased fivefold in 50 years. One forest does not replace another forest. At the foot of these eucalyptus trees, nothing grows because their leaves form a bed that is toxic for most other plants. They grow quickly, but exhaust water reserves. Once the pearl of the Caribbean, Haiti can no longer feed its population without foreign aid. On the hills of Haiti, only 2% of the forests are left. Here's one theory of the story of the Rapa Nui, the inhabitants of Easter Island, that could perhaps give us pause for thought. Living on the most isolated island in the world, the Rapa Nui exploited their resources until there was nothing left. Their civilization did not survive. On these lands stood the highest palm trees in the world. They have disappeared. The Rapa Nui chopped them all down for lumber. They then had to face widespread soil erosion. The Rapa Nui could no longer go fishing. There were no trees to build canoes. The Rapa Nui formed one of the most brilliant civilizations in the Pacific. Innovative farmers, sculptors, exceptional navigators. They were caught in the vice of overpopulation and dwindling resources. They experienced social unrest, revolts, and famine. Many did not survive the cataclysm. The real mystery of Easter Island is not how its strange statues got there. We know now. It's why the Rapa Nui didn't react in time. One human being in 6 now lives in a precarious, unhealthy, overpopulated environment without access to daily necessities such as water, sanitation, or electricity. All over the planet, the poorest scrabble to survive on scraps, while we continue to dig for resources that we can no longer live without. We look farther and farther afield in previously unspoilt territory and in regions that are increasingly difficult to exploit. We're not changing our model. Oil might run out. We can still extract oil from the tar sands of Canada. The biggest trucks in the world move thousands of tons of sand. The process of heating and separating bitumen from the sand requires millions of cubic meters of water. Colossal amounts of energy are needed. The pollution is catastrophic. The most urgent priority, apparently, is to pick every pocket of sunlight. In a few decades, the carbon that made our atmosphere a furnace and that nature captured over millions of years, allowing life to develop, will have largely been pumped back out. The atmosphere is heating up.
The UN Climate Change Summit in Paris, France. This is Democracy Now!
The last version of the text we have is really, really bad, and the United States is the blocker.
The UN Climate Summit has been extended, and civil society groups are calling the latest draft agreement a massive disappointment. We'll have a round table on COP21 with Chi Yokling of Malaysia, Ruth Nyambura from Kenya, and U.S. Indigenous leader Candy Mossett of North Dakota. Then glaciologist Jason Box on the melting ice in Greenland and Antarctica, rising sea levels, and Exxon's cover-up, what they knew as early as the 1970s about climate change.
They were doing some of the best science in the discipline, and they then defunded those programs and then started to actively fund disinformation campaigns to perpetuate their
British
profitability.
Climate expert and former World Bank chief economist Lord Nicholas Stern weighs in on presidential candidate Donald Trump's denial of human-induced climate change.
If he's got new scientific results that overturn 200 years of science and the vast bulk of the science literature, I'm sure that he ought to be publishing them, and the scientific journals would love to see what he has to write.
And the failure to address military carbon emissions. The U.S. military alone uses $20 billion of energy a year, more than any other single U.S. consumer.
The global warming we see today is the result of accumulated greenhouse gases. And how do we share the responsibility of doing the actions that will bring us to 1.5? So that the rich and those who can do more should do their share. And then we will try to do the best on a voluntary basis. And they're backing off from what they agreed to do 20 years ago. We're not cutting emissions at home in Europe or North America. We're not going to give money to help other countries do it.
So we want to get out of this sinking ship, but can't come out of it because the developed countries led by the US are holding the lifeboats. So we're stuck in this thing that's going down. We have floods in India. We have drought in the last 5 years. We've had drought every 2-3 years in East and Horn of Africa. We're seeing the impacts of the climate crisis, and not just with the dramatic, the floods, the hurricanes, and the typhoon. Costs of extractive industries. When you have pollution, when water is taken away from communities, goes to mining companies, goes to corporations. When you talk about 1.5, again, 1.5 for many of us is still a death knell. But if you talk about food security, agroecology, funding that boosts agroecology, funding that adaptation, transportation, issues about water, issues about access to land and resources, that must be taken into account.
For us, it's been a step backwards in the wrong direction. We actually have a text now where we're just referenced in the preamble, so it's not legally binding.
What do you mean?
When
the preamble is not legally binding?
Right, so there's an article. When there's language in the article, that's legally binding language. And what they've actually done is taking out reference to Indigenous people's rights from the article and putting it only into the preamble, which is not legally binding. The same for human rights, the same for food sovereignty. There's just different things that have happened in the text that intergenerational equity is also in the preamble. So a lot of the youth are very upset as to what's happening.
And you talk about the issue of, for example, fracking.
Right. I mean, prior to fracking, we had 7 coal-fired power plants. So we were all dealing with mercury contamination and cancers from that. And then enter fracking around 2007. As far as the environmental toxins, we won't even feel the effects for 20 years, and I'm so worried that at this COP21 my 2.5-year-old daughter won't have a say, but she will be experiencing the worst impacts. And we are considered sacrifice zones in my community now, and it's obvious to me that it's inextricably linked between health, climate, and environment, and we're dealing with it on the front lines.
Candy,
because there's a quote that goes around, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
With Lord Nicholas Stern, the prominent British climate economist, the former chief economist for the World Bank. I asked him about how the United States will allow the words loss and damage in the Paris Accords only if it's agreed that the U.S. is not liable for paying for that loss and damage.
We're back to the difference between voluntary and formal. We as rich countries, I'm from the UK, I count the UK as a rich country along with the United States, have grown rich on high fossil fuel economies, high carbon economies. We have some responsibility.
You talk about what loss and damage is.
Loss and damage is very much what we just heard Candy talk about. I mean, when we say that climate change impacts on us and we have to adapt, but there is a point where you cannot adapt anymore. For example, when the sea level rises on the coastal areas of small islands or Bangladesh or India or China, and the agricultural lands can no longer be used for planting our food, and it's a permanent damage. There's no way you can adapt. That's loss and damage. But the United States has refused at all to even allow the words loss and damage to appear. And the only way there may be a general reference will be to have a permanent waiver by countries here of any liability or compensation notion. Things that Mr. Kerry said last night in the closed-door negotiations is that it is regrettable, but he cannot go back to Washington with a legally binding agreement that has got legally binding cuts in emissions or legally binding finance. So,
can you address the issue of REDD and REDD+? This is something that I think most people in the United States haven't even heard what it stands for, what it means.
It has given polluting countries in the developed world and corporations the ability to say that I will continue to pollute as long as I pay for forest rehabilitation in the global south.
So fracking companies in North Dakota, for example, Candy, could continue to do that if they pay to protect a forest in Southeast Asia, for example.
Exactly. Or after intervening 9 years, we've seen the science grow clearer and clearer about the risks, the intense risks of climate change. We risk rewriting the relationships between human beings and the planet.
What do you think is the greatest threat to the planet right now?
The greatest threat to the planet right now is climate change. In Southeast India, around Chennai, you saw hundreds of people die as a result of rainfalls that have never been seen before. We're seeing records all the time around the world. So some of it's with us now, but that's at 1 degree centigrade. If it went to 2 or 3, the things that we see now as very big would look small.
Has spent the last 2 decades tracking global warming from one of the front lines of climate change, Greenland's ice sheets. From 2008 to 2012, Jason Box was the lead author of the Greenland section of NOAA's annual climate change report. That's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's annual climate change report. In 2012, he was one of the first scientists to warn there would be surface melting across the entirety of Greenland within a decade, a prediction that drew scorn from many in the scientific community until the melting began only a few months later. Jason Box has also participated in protests against climate change, including the 2011 mass protest at the White House. His most recent piece for the New Yorker magazine, co-authored with Naomi Klein, is headlined, "Why a Climate Deal is the Best Hope for Peace." Earlier this year, Esquire ran a profile of Jason Box, headlined, "When the End of Human Civilization is Your Day Job." Jason, come to Democracy Now!
Thanks.
So, talk about Greenland and what's happening and why people should care around the world.
Well, Greenland ice and ice around the world are really good indicators of climate change. That and Arctic climate change is proceeding at about twice the rate of the lower latitudes. The impacts are important globally, even though this is a remote place. We not only sea level rise, which NASA confirmed 1 meter of sea level rise is locked in by the end of this century, and we can't rule out more than that. We don't yet have the models that have specific processes that we know that are happening in the field from our observations. That they're not encoded in the climate models, so we have to look into the past. And what we see is the last time that atmospheric CO2 was at 400 parts per million, global sea level was at least 6 meters higher. So we urgently need to reduce emissions, but also somehow draw down atmospheric carbon. And one great natural technology to do that is in the form of trees and grasses, and to restore soil carbon stores. That's a known kind of technology, natural technology that we need to urgently pursue now.